The courtroom was packed. A sea of faces, some curious, some indifferent, but one face stood out, Judge Preston Wallace. He peered over his glasses, his expression laced with disdain. 17-year-old Malcolm Porter stood before him, hands trembling, dressed in a worn-out hoodie, a stark contrast to the crisp suits surrounding him. Judge Wallace smirked. Well, another statistic in the making. What is it this time? Theft? Drugs? Assault? Malcolm swallowed hard. Sir, Speak up, boy, the judge bellowed, the force of his voice shaking the already fragile confidence Malcolm had left. The courtroom snickered. Malcolm's mother sat in the back, silent tears running down her cheeks. His public defender, barely interested, shuffled some papers. Malcolm clenched his fists. I was defending myself, Your Honor. Judge Wallace chuckled. Defending yourself? Against a fine, upstanding young man like Mr. Landon Hawthorne? The senator's son? No, I think not. He leaned forward, his grin widening. Let me guess, you got jealous, didn't you? Saw a rich white boy with everything you'll never have, and decided to take him down a peg. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream the truth, that Landon had attacked him first, that he had only fought back out of survival. But looking around, he already knew the verdict. I see no need for leniency here, Judge Wallace declared. You need discipline, not excuses. I'll make sure you learn. The gavel slammed. Guilty. The sentence was swift. Juvenile detention. 6 months. Malcolm's mother sobbed, pleading with the judge, but Wallace had already moved on. Another case. Another young black life dismissed like an afterthought. Inside those walls, Malcolm learned more than survival. He learned strategy. He devoured books on law, studied cases, memorized tactics. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment Judge Wallace humiliated and played in his mind like a broken record. He made a vow. One day, he'd be the one holding the gavel. Years passed. Malcolm fought for everything. Law school, internships, endless nights of studying. Every rejection only fueled his fire. And then the moment came. The district attorney's office took notice. The youngest assistant DA in the state. A headline in every paper. But the real moment of justice? That was about to come. Judge Wallace at his bench. Older now, but just as smug. Another case. Another defendant. He barely looked up when the prosecutor stepped forward. State your name for the record, Wallace said, flipping through his papers. A pause. Then a voice firm, steady, unshaken. Malcolm Porter, Assistant District Attorney. Judge Wallace's hand froze over his gavel. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, eyes widening as he took in the man standing before him. The courtroom was silent. Malcolm stood tall, wearing the very same kind of suit Wallace once sneered at him for not having. He met the judge's eyes, unflinching, unapologetic. We meet again, Your Honor. Wallace's throat went dry. The last time he saw Malcolm, he was a frightened teenager. Now, he was a man who could make or break cases in his courtroom. And this time, the power shift was undeniable. The tension in the courtroom was thick, suffocating. Judge Wallace's hands twitched as he adjusted his robe, his gaze flickering over Malcolm as if trying to make sense of the man standing before him. Malcolm Porter. Wallace finally murmured, almost to himself, Assistant Day. Malcolm allowed a small, knowing smile. Surprised to see me, Your Honor? The room was still. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. The last time Malcolm was in this courtroom, he was a powerless teenager, crushed beneath the weight of a system that never gave him a chance. Now he was the one who could dictate the course of justice. Wallace started, then cleared his throat, regaining a sliver of his usual arrogance. I had no idea you pursued law. Malcolm clasped his hands behind his back. I suppose you wouldn't. But I remember you, Judge Wallace. I remember every word you spoke that day. I remember how you laughed, how you called me a statistic. He took a step closer. How you sentenced me without a second thought. Wallace straightened. Mr. Porter, I don't see how this is relevant to the case before us. His voice wavered slightly, betraying the unease beneath his rigid demeanor. Malcolm nodded. Oh, but it is. Because today, I am not the one on trial. I am the one who holds a case against the defendant. He turned, gesturing toward the man seated at the defense table. Your Honor, today's defendant is none other than Landon Hawthorne. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Wallace's face paled. Landon Hawthorne, the same privileged son of a senator who had attacked Malcolm all those years ago. The same boy who had walked free while Malcolm had been labeled a criminal. Objection! The defense attorney called out hastily. Your Honor, the prosecution is clearly making this personal. Wallace gripped his gavel. Sustained. He turned to Malcolm. Mr. Porter, I trust you will conduct this case with professionalism. Malcolm held the judge's gaze. Of course, Your Honor. I intend to uphold the law, something this courtroom once failed to do for me. The trial commenced, and Malcolm was relentless. He presented the evidence. Financial fraud, bribery, assault charges that Landon had evaded for years, covered up by his father's influence. But no more. Every witness, every document, every shred of proof painted the picture of a man who had never faced the consequences of his actions. And for the first time, Landon looked scared. Wallace tried to maintain his composure, but Malcolm could see the way his hands clenched, the flicker of recognition in his eyes. This was not how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one in control, not Malcolm. At the end of the prosecution's argument, Malcolm turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I request that Landon Hawthorne be remanded without bail. He is a flight risk, and given his history of evading justice, the people request he remain in custody. Landon's attorney jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client is a respected businessman. He has no reason to flee. Malcolm's eyes darkened. No reason? Just like he had no reason to attack an innocent teenager all those years ago. Just like he had no reason to think the law didn't apply to him. Wallace hesitated. Malcolm saw the struggle written across his face. If he ruled in Landon's favor, it would confirm what everyone suspected, that he was still protecting the privileged. If he ruled in Malcolm's favor, it would mean betraying the very people who had once propped up his career. Silence stretched across the courtroom. Then, finally, Wallace exhaled. Bail is denied. Gasps. Landon slammed his fists on the table. You can't do this to me, he shouted. Do you know who my father is? Wallace banged his gavel. Enough. But his voice lacked its usual authority. He turned to the bailiff. Take the defendant into custody. As Landon was led away, Malcolm felt a strange sense of justice settle over him. But it wasn't enough. Not yet, because there was still one person left who had to face the consequences. Court adjourned. The room emptied, but Malcolm remained. And so did Judge Wallace. The older man sighed, rubbing his temples. I suppose you think this makes us even. Malcolm's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, no, Your Honor. We're far from even. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a file, placing it gently on Wallace's bench. Wallace hesitated before picking it up. His eyes scanned the contents, and then they widened in horror. This is... Malcolm nodded. Proof of every case you've ever mishandled. Every defendant you sentenced unfairly. Every time you let people like Landon Hawthorne walk free while destroying the lives of those who couldn't afford justice. He leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. It's over, Judge. Wallace's face turned red. You have no right. I have every right, Malcolm interrupted. Because you taught me that power isn't given. It's taken, and I'm taking it back. Wallace stood abruptly. You think you can ruin me? Malcolm tilted his head. Oh, I don't need to ruin you, Judge. You did that yourself. He tapped the file. This will be on the governor's desk by morning. And if I were you, I'd start preparing for a new kind of courtroom. One where you're not the judge. Wallace's breaths came short and fast. You wouldn't. Malcolm smiled, slow and deliberate. Watch me. The judge's gavel, once a symbol of his absolute power, now felt meaningless in his grasp. His hands shook as he realized the inevitable. And Malcolm? Malcolm walked away, knowing this battle was far from over. Malcolm stepped out of the courtroom, inhaling the cool evening air. The city lights flickered in the distance, a silent testament to how far he had come. Behind him, the courthouse stood tall, a monument to justice, or in Wallace's case, a crumbling empire built on the broken lives of others. His phone buzzed. A message from his mentor, District Attorney Robert Langston. "We need to talk. Urgent." Malcolm frowned. He had expected some fallout from Wallace's reaction, but something about the urgency of the message unsettled him. Without hesitation, he hailed a cab and headed toward Langston's office. The DA's office was dimly lit when Malcolm arrived. Langston sat behind his desk, a weary look on his face. He gestured for Malcolm to take a seat. "Word travels fast," Langston said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest." Malcolm opened the folder. Inside were documents. Cases linked to Wallace, hidden transactions, names of powerful individuals who had benefited from his corrupt rulings. But something else stood out. A sealed affidavit. Malcolm's name was on it. His breath hitched. "What is this?" Langston folded his hands. "A counterattack." He leaned forward. "Wallace isn't going down without a fight. He's already contacted his connections. Judges, politicians, law enforcement officials. He's painting you as a vengeful prosecutor with a personal vendetta." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "So he's trying to flip the script, make me the villain." Langston nodded. "And he's good at it. He's claiming you used your position to unfairly target him and Landon Hawthorne, that you manufactured evidence." Malcolm scoffed. "That's ridiculous." "It doesn't matter what's ridiculous, Malcolm. It matters what people believe." Langston exhaled. "You need to be careful. Wallace has been playing this game longer than you. He's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." Malcolm clenched his fists. He had worked too hard, come too far, to let Wallace twist a narrative. But Langston was right. If Wallace had allies willing to back his story, Malcolm's entire career could be on the line. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the DA's office early. He needed to think, needed to plan. But as he walked through the lobby, a hush fell over the room. He glanced at a nearby television. A news anchor's voice rang out. "Breaking news. Explosive allegations against Assistant DA Malcolm Porter." Malcolm's blood ran cold. The screen changed to footage of Wallace, speaking to reporters. He looked composed, confident. A stark contrast to the panic Malcolm had seen in him just yesterday. "I have always believed in fairness," Wallace declared. "But it is clear that Mr. Porter is abusing his position to settle old grudges. This is not justice. This is revenge." The camera panned to Landon Hawthorne's attorney, who held up a stack of documents. "We have reason to believe Mr. Porter has manipulated evidence in an attempt to frame my client," he said. "We are calling for an immediate investigation into his conduct." Malcolm's stomach turned. It was a coordinated attack. Wallace, Landon, their allies, they had come together to discredit him. And the worst part? The public was eating it up. His phone rang. "Langston, we have a problem." Langston said the moment Malcolm answered. "The state bar is looking into this. If they find anything they can use, you could be disbarred." Malcolm gritted his teeth. "Then we hit back." Langston hesitated. "Careful. If you move too aggressively, it'll play into their hands. They want to paint you as reckless, unhinged. We need to be strategic." Malcolm exhaled. He had spent years building his career. He wouldn't let Wallace take it from him. "I have a plan," he said finally, "but I need to find proof. Real proof that Wallace is behind this." Langston sighed. "That won't be easy." "I don't need easy. I need the truth." Malcolm knew exactly where to start. Wallace had been too confident, too quick to strike back, which meant he had planned this. And if he had planned it, there were breadcrumbs to follow. With a deep breath, he made his way to the records office. He needed court documents, case files, anything that could expose Wallace's network. He scrolled through past cases, tracing patterns. And then he found it, a shell company. A series of financial transactions linking Wallace to a major law firm known for burying cases. And the name attached to the biggest payment? Landon Hawthorne. Malcolm's heart pounded. It was a smoking gun. Proof that Wallace had been covering up for Landon for years. But just as he reached for his phone, a shadow loomed over him. Looking for something? Malcolm turned. A tall man in a dark suit stood in the doorway. Cold eyes, sharp features. Someone who didn't belong in the records room. Malcolm's instinct screamed at him. Something was wrong. "I don't believe we've met," Malcolm said carefully. The man smirked. "Let's keep it that way." Then, before Malcolm could react, the man reached into his coat. Malcolm moved fast, but not fast enough. A sharp pain exploded in his side as something cold and metallic pressed against him. A gun. His vision blurred. His knees buckled. He hit the ground. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the man's voice, smooth and chilling. "You should have stayed in your place." This story is about to get intense. Watch out for part 2 and do well to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss chilling racist stories like this. Also comment your thought in the comment section. Until then, stay safe.